At 18, she was traded to a solitary Comanche for a horse and endless nights on the road to freedom. The territory stretching out past the Pecos River was a scar of cracked clay and relentless sun, a place where the wind felt less like a breeze and more like the constant sigh of a dying world. Still, the nights were cold enough to remind a man he was mortal, and the days dry enough to keep his spirit as brittle as the dead mesquite that lined the dusty creek beds. I, Silas Vance, had spent the better part of the last decade on this desolate edge of the Llano Estacado's caprock, not in search of riches or new beginnings, but in deliberate, suffocating solitude. It was just me, and the relentless rhythm of my own failure. I'd built a small ranch, not a monument to my future, but a mausoleum for my past, a square of hard-won land tucked against the unforgiving rise of the Black Mesa. The earth here was too poor for much, good only for the grazing of a few tough cattle, which was exactly how I preferred it, modest, predictable, with no debts to pay but the one I owed to my conscience, a debt I knew would never clear. At 45, I had seen enough of the world's supposed progress to turn my back on it. I remembered the crisp smell of gunpowder and the bitter taste of betrayal when I'd ridden with the Texas Rangers not as a hero, but as a witness to the slow, brutal death of honor. I had lost more than friends in those conflicts. I'd lost the belief that justice was something a man could chase with a badge and a gun. I had been sent to broker a brittle peace with a small band of Comanche deep in the territory, a peace that was supposed to secure their land against the inevitable tide of settlers. My word, the word of a ranger, had been the treaty's only seal. Then, a night raid by land grabbers, a volley of unforgivable shots, and I had watched a family, whom I'd sworn to protect, vanish in the smoke. The image of the father, his eyes wide with a confusion more damning than hatred, was the ghost that now rode with me every dawn. I hadn't pulled the trigger, but I hadn't stopped it either. After that, I had stopped chasing justice and started building a wall of silence around myself, a penance I lived inside every day. No one could die from a broken fence post or a cold cup of coffee. My honor was a thing I thought I'd successfully buried, yet the guilt remained, a silent, festering wound that never quite healed. I was out checking a water trough near a narrow, twisting gulch, a cut in the earth known locally as Rattlesnake Gully, when I heard it. The sound was wrong for the silence of the desert. It wasn't the hum of flies, nor the distant lowing of cattle. It was a sharp, human cry, quickly muffled, followed by the terrible splintering of wood and the thunderous, desperate clatter of a runaway horse and wagon. My gut instantly coiled tight. This wasn't a traveler lost or a drunken cowboy fallen from his saddle. This was trouble, the kind that brought back the cold, familiar knot in my stomach, the kind that smelled of blood and bad men. I untied the reins of my gelding, a sturdy bay named Dusty, swung into the saddle, and urged the horse toward the gulch. My hand instinctively rested on the scarred walnut stock of my Winchester rifle, secured in the scabbard. Every beat of my heart felt like a drum pulling me back in time, back into the gamble of violence I'd sworn I'd abandon. It took 5 minutes of hard riding to reach the lip of the gulch, and the sight that unfolded below forced Dusty to a sudden, stumbling halt. A large, heavy wagon lay shattered on its side, one wheel still spinning in a slow, pathetic arc. 2 men in filthy, dust-caked coats were struggling to pull a third man, pinned beneath the axle, free. But it was the fourth man who held my attention, a tall, wiry figure with eyes that didn't just look cold, they looked calculated. He was pacing, spitting curses into the wind, a self-important fury radiating from him. I recognized the air of him instantly. The leader, the one who saw himself as a higher authority, one who thought he owned the rules of this broken territory. This was Barton Thorne, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and false respect in the lawless settlements, a man who had once worn a cheap, self-appointed judge's star and now wore a sneer that promised pain. Then I saw her. She was tangled in the wreckage, a small, still figure in a torn, simple, buckskin garment. Her dark, thick hair was a wild, desperate tangle, some of it snagged on a jagged piece of wood. She was holding her arm tightly to her side, and the tear in the hide of her clothing was soaked with a wet, spreading darkness that told me the truth before my eyes could process it. She was hurt, badly. She had the look of the land, of the people I had failed. Comanche, a woman of the high plains, a daughter of the nation I had once promised my word to. The men hadn't seen me yet, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, I had a clear shot at Thorn, the judge, the one with the calculating eyes. But my gaze, against all instinct, fixed on the Comanche woman, Nara. Her face, though marred by dirt and pain, was set in an expression of silent, furious defiance. It wasn't the face of a victim begging for release. It was the face of a warrior trapped. That look, that sheer, unspoken will, tore through the thick armor of cynicism I had built over a decade. I didn't blame the war for my failure. I blamed men like Thorn, men who traded in human misery, who saw dignity as something to be bought and sold, especially the dignity of the native people, whom the civilized world had already decreed as little more than property. The ghost of the father I failed, the Comanche elder who looked at me with that final, bewildered gaze, rose from the grave of my guilt, demanding retribution. A man must pay his debts, the desert whispered. I couldn't ride away. Not again. Not while a piece of my lost honor lay bleeding in the dust below me. I dismounted with a practiced, fluid motion, the reins dropping to the dirt. I took cover behind a tight cluster of sagebrush, steadied the Winchester against a low-lying rock, and, instead of firing a killing shot, aimed at the axle of the overturned wagon. The shot cracked the stillness, a deafening explosion of sound and splintered wood, a warning shot meant to be impossible to ignore. The men froze, their heads snapping up, eyes scanning the rim of the gulch for the source of the shot. "Get out!" I roared, my voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to travel through the earth itself. "This ain't your land, and that Comanche woman ain't your prize. Leave her, or you'll meet the end of the ranger's wall." Thorn finally spotted me, his cruel eyes narrowing. A cold, yellow-toothed grin split his face. Well, if it ain't the ghost of Texas, Silas Vance," he sneered, his voice as slick and poisonous as oil on water. They said the wall had retired to his little dirt patch. "You looking to play hero, old man? That's my bounty. Stolen goods a runaway slave, and she's worth a king's ransom to the right buyer." I didn't flinch, didn't answer with words. The second shot was a carefully placed, calculated insult. The bullet kicked up a sharp fan of dust right between Thorn's worn leather boots. Thorn jumped back, a look of pure, murderous hatred twisting his features, wiping away the self-satisfied grin. "The wall doesn't move." My voice was steady, uncompromising. "Leave her and ride. The next shot won't be a warning." Thorn hesitated, his mind racing. He glanced at his men, one still trapped under the wreckage, at the woman, and then back at the ominous silence from the ridge. He was a smart villain, a predator who knew when the odds had turned. "This ain't over, Vance," he snarled, a promise more than a threat. "That girl has a price on her head, and I'll collect it, dead or alive, even if I have to burn this whole godforsaken territory to find you." He grabbed the reins of his horse and rode out in a cloud of dust, abandoning his two injured partners without a second thought, his only concern the bounty he'd lost. I waited, rifle still raised, a shadow against the blazing sky, until the last sound of hoofbeats faded. Then, and only then, did I move. I walked slowly down into the gulch, rifle ready, my eyes sweeping the horizon. The Comanche woman lay almost motionless. The wound was worse than I'd thought. The fabric and skin around her arm and torso, a mess of deep, disturbing color. I crouched beside her, keeping one eye on the escape route Thorn had taken. Her eyes, the deep, impenetrable color of a winter night, fluttered open. They met mine without fear, without a plea for mercy, only a searing, intense assessment. It was that look, the courage beneath the pain, that affirmed my choice. She wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, a survivor. "All right," I muttered, my voice rough. "Let's get you out of here, Nara." I slid the Winchester into the crook of my arm, lifted her with utmost care, and carried her heavy, fragile weight up to Dusty. This was different from the dead weight of a soldier or a drunk ranch hand. This was a responsibility I had chosen, a piece of the past I was finally attempting to redeem. She was someone's daughter, a woman who had met the worst of men. I draped her across the saddle, mounted behind her, and held her steady with one powerful arm while guiding Dusty with the other. The ride back to the cabin was excruciatingly slow, every movement a risk. I could feel her shallow, ragged breathing against my chest, the wet, sticky warmth of her blood seeping into my shirt. By the time we reached my cabin, a rough timber structure against a stone hearth, the sun was a sinking, violent red. I kicked the door open with my boot and laid the young woman gently on my only cot, then immediately lit the oil lamp. I moved with a focused calm I hadn't felt since my ranger days. Water was put on to boil, needle and thread laid out, my sharpest skinning knife cleaned. I washed my hands, then, with a heavy heart, tore open the buckskin dress and began to assess the damage. The wounds were extensive, deep lacerations and bruising from being dragged, but a central, nasty tear on her side suggested a broken rib or internal damage from a kick or a heavy impact. Luck, if such a thing existed out here, was with us. No bullet wound, no immediately visible compound fracture, but the injury was deep, and a fever would be the true enemy. She let out a low, guttural moan as I poured my precious, strong whiskey, my only disinfectant, into the gash. "I know," I said, my voice low, steady, a comfort. The good stuff always hurts the most. I worked in the deepening shadows for over an hour, my large, calloused hands becoming surprisingly delicate. I stitched the worst cuts slowly, precisely, packing the deeper abrasions with clean cloth strips and bandages cut from an old linen shirt, a final, fragile barrier against the hungry desert bacteria. It wasn't a doctor's work, but it was honest, careful work. When it was finished, I sat heavily in my only chair by the small fire, watching her breathe shallow, uneven, barely there. I, the man who had lived for years in perfect, guarded solitude, was now sharing my sanctuary with a Comanche woman I'd just dragged back from the brink of death, a choice that had just made me the primary target of one of the territory's most brutal men. I wasn't sure what came next, only that the thought of letting a soul die alone, broken, in the dirt, was a sickness I couldn't stomach. Not again. Not after that final, condemning gaze of the Comanche father I'd failed so long ago. I had done what my long-dormant honor demanded. That was enough for now. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat by the bedside, a silent, unmoving guardian. I hadn't asked her name, didn't know her family, didn't know if her people would come looking for her. I only knew she was here because of a broken promise I was finally attempting to mend. The weight of my rifle, leaned against the stone hearth, felt less like a tool of defense and more like a sign of the life I had just been dragged back into. The quiet in the cabin was now a shared space, weighted with her difficult, shallow breaths, the only sound the crackle of the wood in the fire. I was a man of action, not of prayer, but as I watched her fragile form fight for life, I made a silent vow to the barren land. She will survive. I will see her safe. A man's life, or what he had mistakenly called a life, could be charted by the emptiness it contained. The emptiness after the last shot was fired, the emptiness of a table set for one, the cavernous silence, where a simple word of forgiveness should have been spoken a decade ago. Now, a fragile human being lay between me and that emptiness. A barrier of flesh and blood against the silence I had long sought, but now desperately feared. The irony was a cruel, beautiful knife twist. In saving her, I had finally, irrevocably, lost my solitude. But perhaps, the weary soul of the former ranger dared to whisper, losing everything was the only true way to find a thing worth keeping. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Nara did not speak for 3 days. Her silence wasn't empty. It was tight as a drumhead, full of things that refused to be said. If there were words in her throat, they'd lodged like thorns, and any attempt to pull them free would only rip at tender places I had no right to touch. I didn't ask for thanks. I didn't ask for anything. A man doesn't rescue another human being for applause, not if he plans on sleeping at night. You do what decency demands, and then you keep your mouth shut and your hands steady. The cabin changed the moment she crossed its threshold. Before, it was a brittle kingdom of one. Stacked firewood cut to the same length, a single cot tucked under a window that looked toward the black mesa, a table scarred by a decade of coffee cups and quiet. Now the air carried the soft ghost of her breath, a second cadence working beside the crackle of the hearth. There was a new weight in the room. Not heavy, just undeniable. I felt it when I set the kettle, when I folded a clean strip of linen, when I turned and found her eyes on me, watchful and sharp, like stars through smoke. Mornings, I changed her bandages and kept my hands gentler than I knew I had. Whiskey kept the rot at bay. Boiled water did the rest. The bad tear along her ribs had the look of a thing earned by a hard boot or the blunt corner of a plank. I stitched it tight, low and patient, counting the needle in and out, as if prayer could be measured by passing thread. When fever came, it came like weather fast and determined, slicking her skin and turning her breath into a rasp. I spooned broth between lips that barely parted and listened to the fire argue softly with the wind. Nights, I sat in the chair by the hearth and tried not to remember other nights, scout fires, seen from a distance, the pale flare of a match at the mouth of a tent, the sound a man makes when he's shot and too stunned to understand it yet. If you sit quietly enough, the past will come and sit beside you, elbows on its knees, like an old friend who never learned when to leave. I'd built a wall out here to keep it out. Fences are honest, wood is predictable, cattle are stupid and kind, but the wall had a door, and I'd just opened it. She watched me the way one watches storms, no trust given, none withheld, just the human instinct to know what might break next. In those 3 days we shared maybe 30 words. Water, turn, hold still, the basics of staying alive and not making things worse. Once, halfway to dawn, she whispered something in her own tongue, more rhythm than meaning to my ear, and I realized she hadn't used her voice in so long it had gathered dust. Outside, the land held its breath. The 4th day split open without a sound, cold enough to ache my teeth. I went to the barn to check Dusty, and found the world too quiet, as if everything living had agreed to keep still at once. That kind of quiet is a blade. It shaves the hair along your neck and tells you what your nerves already suspect. Trouble is standing just out of sight, flexing its fingers. I meant only to check the feed bin and top the water bucket. What I found was that old canvas satchel I'd tucked under a coil of wire weeks ago, half forgotten in the way you only forget what you hope you'll never need. I pulled it open and stared down at 4 wax-papered tubes that could do a man's work in stone or a devil's work in flesh. The miner had said they were good sticks, dry as a sermon, steady if you didn't insult them. I'm not proud of the relief that went through me when I saw them. A rifle stops one man. Dynamite can stop a move. I turned a single stick in my hands, feeling the tamped powder shift soft as flour behind the paper. Any tool can be a sin if you use it wrong. Any sin can be a tool if you're careful. Habit took it from there. I slid the stick into the inside pocket of my coat and told myself it was foolish. Another voice, the older, harder voice that had gotten me through uglier rooms, told me, foolishness keeps you breathing when villains are particular. I stepped out of the barn with the bucket, and the day sharpened around me. The sky kept its color, but the light thinned, as if the sun had pulled a veil over its face. I didn't hear horses. I didn't hear men. I heard the slow creak of my cabin's floorboards and the metallic whisper of a bolt pulled back against a chamber. That whisper will find your spine even if you're deaf to everything else. The bucket hit the dirt still half full. I ran. I hit the doorframe with my shoulder, rifle up, mouth already shaping a curse, and saw Nara propped at the window on unsteady legs, her hands wrapped around my Winchester like a woman holding back a river. She didn't glance at me. She looked past me, at the light knifing through the door I'd failed to latch. The look in her eyes was not the look of prey. It was calculation and animal fear and memory she didn't want to have. Then the growl rolled in from the yard. Every man who's spent enough time on the wrong end of wildness knows the difference between a dog's threat and a bear's opinion. A dog warns. A bear explains. The explanation dug its claws into my floorboards, and the cabin took a deep breath it couldn't quite finish. I didn't have to step outside to know who had brought that trouble to my threshold. Barton Thorne had struck me as a man who believed that cruelty proved intelligence. Men like that love theater. You give them a curtain, and they'll bring their own orchestra. He called then, from 10 or 12 feet beyond the door. "Come on out, Wall," he sang, high and amused. "Or I'll let my friend redecorate. He's partial to open floor plans." I could see us both, as if I'd climbed out of my body and taken a surveyor's sight. Me in the dim, Nara pale at the glass, Thorne in the cold morning, one hand near the chain of a beast that could pull down a tree if it wanted it badly enough. He would have a grin on like a boil. The bear would be restless from travel and scenting blood, and I would be calculating terrible math. Shoot the man, and the chain falls. Shoot the bear, and the chain breaks. Do nothing, and the world rushes in to tell you it never liked you anyway. Nara's hands trembled on the rifle, but not helplessly. She had the trigger in the tender V between forefinger and thumb the way I'd shown green boys 100 years ago. Her breath feathered against the cold pain. The bandage at her ribs had bled through in one crescent moon after another, and the way she stood told me the pain stood with her. Still, she put herself between the window and whatever wanted to end us. Bravery is rarely loud. Sometimes it's a woman with a fever choosing the harder angle on a wobbly leg. Thorne let the chain clink so the sound would enter the cabin before the bear did. "You think she's safer in there," he called. "Walls fall. Even the wall falls." Lie. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember the old voice in my head, the one that sounded like a man I'd failed, saying, "This isn't about your life, it's about your choice. The difference matters." I set my rifle on the table, quietly enough that the wood didn't remark upon it. Nara's eyes flicked toward me, fast and furious. "No," she whispered, one word cracked by disuse and fear. "Listen," I said, and I kept my voice soft, the way you talk to a horse that could go either way. "When I open that door, you go to the back. Crawl if you have to. When the hinge squeals, you're already gone. You find the trail I cut through the sage to the arroyo, and you run it like it's a story your grandmother told you twice." She shook her head hard enough to hurt. Something flamed in her gaze, anger at my audacity. Maybe, or the memory of men who said they'd be brave and weren't. I couldn't fix that with talk. A man's record is written in actions, not alibis. I put my left hand to the bolt, and my right hand inside my coat. Paper whispered against my knuckles. The matchbook in my mouth tasted like sulfur and old promises. When I slid the bolt, it felt like laying a card down that you already knew would cost the pot. The door cracked wide enough to slice the morning. The bear's breath blew in first, rank, wet, vital. Then Thorne's voice, closer. "There he is," he said, and even unseen, I could hear the smile stretching. "Come take your licking like a good wall." 3 things happened in a small space of time. The match head rasped and flowered. The fuse took the fire with a soft, eager hiss. The bear surged 6 inches into the doorway, a black mass that blocked the weather. There's a wrong way to throw dynamite, and a right one. The wrong way is at what you hate. The right way is at what your enemy needs. I snapped my wrist and sent the stick low and short, not at the bear's shoulder or Thorne's kneecap, but into the mean little world they shared between them. The explosion didn't boom, it punched. The cabin floor heaved once under my boots, and then came down ashamed of itself. The air turned white with dust, and brown with thrown dirt, and glittering with splinters that used to be part of my doorframe. The bear reeled back, roared a formal protest to the gods, and found its chain insufficient to the moment. Metal shrieked. Something broke, maybe the ring in the beast's collar. Maybe the idea that Thorne had the day by the throat. Sound flattened for me, as if somebody had taken a thumb and pressed the world's ears shut. What I heard was mostly my own breath and Nara saying something sharp. Through the tearing veil of dust, I saw just barely the bear's great head swing toward the nearest pain it could name. Thorne had thought himself conductor. In the next beat, he found himself the drum. I didn't watch the rest. I don't need to remember any more men dying than I already do. I turned, found Nara's wrist with the gentleness you use to take a knife from a friend's hand, and hauled us toward the back room where the last unbroken window lived. We didn't waste the door. Thorn had let me keep the walls. I wouldn't repay him by using his routes. Down, I said. I shoved the window sash high and shouldered through first, so I'd be the one to bleed if the world had posted a surprise on the sill. The morning on that side of the cabin smelled like sage and old wood ash. I dropped into it, caught her hips, and lowered her over the sill with as little insult to her ribs as a man in a hurry could manage. When her bare feet met the cold dirt, she sucked in a sharp breath that could have been pain or resolve. We ran bent double along the north wall, stepping where the shade still held the frost. Halfway to the juniper windbreak, my ears unclogged, and the noise from the front yard knifed in all claws and man-shrieks, and the gunshots of frightened fools who had no target left that wouldn't kill them back. One shot snapped something off the corner of my cabin. Another hammered the dead wagon tongue I'd leaned against the wall last spring. Splinters patted our boots. Survival is sometimes a series of apologies you don't have time to say to the things you love. The arroyo lay 30 yards off, a shallow scar torn by a decade of flash floods that never arrived. I'd cut a trail along its lip for hauling firewood, a pale thread in the mesquite that you could follow with your eyes closed if you'd walked it enough. I grabbed Nara's hand and put us on that thread. Her steps were small and fast, the way the wounded run when they refuse to argue with their own bodies. Twice she stumbled. Twice she caught herself with the same stubborn quiet she'd used to keep breathing on my cot. The world narrowed to footfalls and air. Behind us, Dusty shrieked once, offended by the noise, then settled into the wisdom of a horse that knows when men are writing a bad ending. I promised him grain with the part of my mind that still believed we'd see home again. Ahead, the arroyo's bend offered the first true mercy of the day. A blind turn no bullet could negotiate. We slid down into the sandy gut of it and let the earth take some of the weight. It was cooler there. The wind didn't reach. The noise softened by one measure. I counted that as a win. We moved at a crouch, and I kept my head at a tilt, listening for the pound of hooves or the ragged, ugly sound of men running after a thing they'd already lost. No pursuit came, not yet. Maybe Thorn's men were busy learning about consequences. Maybe the blast had stunned them past bravery. Maybe they'd decided that vengeance could wait until vengeance didn't have teeth. In the West, even cowards bide their time, and Barton Thorn, if the bear had left him any breath at all, would be the kind of man who made a habit of it. We took the arroyo for a mile, then another. The land unrolled, the way a map does when you set books on its corners to keep it honest. We kept to the shade where the banks rose and the soil held moisture. Twice, we stopped long enough for me to lift the bandage and check the wound along her ribs. The edge had seeped through, but not enough to scare me. The heat under my palm told me fever would dog us like a half-tamed pup coming and going, never quite putting its teeth down. She pointed once, a small motion, toward the northeast, where the black mesa leaned its shoulder against the sky. She didn't have to speak for me to understand. The cliffs there held dry caves and overhangs that caught the morning shade and held it generous past noon. Good places to be invisible. Good places to lick wounds and count provisions. I nodded, and we turned that way. By mid-morning, the ache in my right shoulder shaken loose by the concussion and the sprint had settled into a reluctant truce. My hands had started the day steady. By noon they had their old tremor back, the one I'd trained into usefulness years ago. A man can thread a needle with shaking hands. He just learns to use the rhythm. We rationed water. Tiny sips that only reminded your mouth of what thirst truly is. Clouds built over distant hills, thought better of it, and dissolved. When we finally climbed out of the arroyo, it was to trade one sort of concealment for another. The mesa's flank lifted before us in broken shelves, sandstone the color of old blood and sun-faded brick. Creosote and prickly pear stood where they could. Everything else learned humility. I took the lead, testing each foothold twice before I asked it to hold more than my pride. Nara moved like someone who'd been walking rock since the day she learned to stand carefully, efficiently. No despair wasted on bad angles. We found an overhang with a low ceiling and a floor of sand as soft as any bed we'd see for a while. The opening faced north, out of the worst of the sun, and a trick of the cliff made it invisible from below unless you knew it was there. I checked the ground for scat and bones, and found only a few lizard tracks and the curve of a raven feather, slick as a lie. It would do. We settled inside and breathed like people who'd forgotten how. For a long time there was no sound but the small mechanical noises bodies make when they've got nothing left to prove. Swallow, sigh, the shiver that shakes out of a limb when the work is over. I shook 2 thin blankets free of the dust that travels with men and tucked one beneath her and one around her shoulders. Cold comes fast in shade on rock. Water, she said. That single word still rough, but more herself now, as if the running had sanded something smooth. I gave her the canteen and watched her sip, pull away, wait, then sip again. Discipline learned the hard way. After 3 swallows, she pressed the canteen back into my palm. I didn't argue. You don't guide a person to the door of survival and then push them through with your back turned. My own throat thanked me for the one mouthful I allowed it. We ate 2 strips of jerky I'd tucked inside my coat, a poor apology for hunger, but enough to tell the blood to keep its promises for another hour. My hands wanted to sleep. My ears kept working. From our perch, the world sounded honest. Wind scraping a lonely song along the stone, some tiny insect's persistent hymn, a hawk writing a circle in the sky with the pencil of its cry. No men, no hooves, no clatter of chains. Nara watched me watch. If there was judgment in her eyes, it had softened into curiosity, or maybe cataloging. People who live by wits learn to inventory the souls around them. At length, she lay back against the blanket and pressed her palms flat to the sand, as if taking the earth's pulse and lending it hers. You should sleep, I said. Her mouth tugged one corner, something not quite a smile, not quite not. You, she managed, and lifted a hand to touch the bandage at my shoulder. The gesture was quick, almost shy, a question asked, without the burden of an answer. It'll hold, I told her. Everything that needs holding will hold. Lo, I meant the words for her ribs, for my shoulder, for the flimsy plan that had got us this far. I meant them for the thin seam of trust that had formed between us, narrow as a creek in drought, but real water all the same. She let her hand fall, and for the first time since she'd woken on my cot, her lashes settled against her cheek in surrender to something like rest. I stayed propped at the mouth of the overhang and scanned the world in quarters until the sun leaned west. Once, a pair of riders pocked the distance, too far to identify, heading south at a speed that suggested they'd decided not to test their fortunes near any houses that morning. Once, a raven parked itself on a dead branch and watched me with a patience I recognized from my own mirror. I didn't invite it closer. I've had enough company with bad omens for one lifetime. Toward evening, I crushed what I could find in the way of medicine. Desert plants ask a man to be humble. If you'd asked me 10 years ago what use there was in a bitter sprig of this or a greasy leaf of that, I'd have told you guns did quicker work. But I'd learned a thing or two from soldiers who preferred life, and from women who refused to yield it. I made a poultice that smelled like a promise and tied it against the heat of her skin. She didn't wake when I did it. Her breath steadied, counting slowly in the school of sleep. My mind tried to wander back to the cabin, what remained of it, which boards would nurse splinters with my name on them for the next century, whether Dusty had the good sense to bolt for the draw or the dumb loyalty to stay tied. I pushed the thinking aside and made myself stay with the practical. How many rounds left? How many matches? How long the canteen could play at full? When fear wanted a seat beside me, I set a place for it at the far end of the blanket and told it to keep quiet while grown folks talked. Night slid in, blue and opinionated, and with it came the clean bite of cold. I cut the sleeves off my spare shirt to fashion a better wrap across Nara's ribs, then pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and banked the small ember of a cave-edge fire I dared to coax to life. No flame, no smoke, just the memory of heat trapped under stones that had known the sun all day. We slept in shifts after that, she first, then me, trading the sky between us, letting it tell time on our behalf. In the hour when coyotes begin their gossip, she woke and turned on her side to face me, eyes bright in the dusk like the last coals of a forge. She studied my face with an intimacy that didn't feel like trespass, only assessment the way a healer studies a wound, measuring the distance between injury and repair. "Why?" she asked. The word was small, but it radiated through the cave like something dropped into a well. She could have meant a dozen things. "Why did you shoot at the axle and not the man? Why did you bring me to your bed and not the sheriff's? Why did you throw your life under the hooves of a morning you didn't have to own?" I answered the piece I understood best. "Because I owed a debt," I said. "Not the kind you pay with coins, the kind you pay by deciding who you're going to be when nobody tells you." Silence returned, but it was different now, thicker, kinder. She held it between her fingers a moment, then let it settle. The wind changed at the cave mouth, bringing with it a smell I recognized too well, smoke faint as a rumor. It could have been a homesteader 3 miles off burning a brush pile. It could have been the ghost of old fires caught in a whirl, but it put a new edge on every sense I had left. I pressed 2 fingers to the floor, felt the small hum that stone carries when hooves drum its bigger brothers somewhere out of sight. 1 beat, then 2, then 3, irregularly spaced the pattern of a group that had not agreed on how fast to go or how brave to be. I rose without ceremony and checked the Winchester, the weight of it truer than memory. Nara, without being told, squinted into the last light and rolled her shoulders to wake the parts of her that pain had convinced to lie still. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Whatever came up that slope would make us name ourselves again, so we saved our breath for the introductions. And there the day paused, like a man holding a card just shy of laying it on the table, deciding if he believes in luck or the work of his own hands. The hoofbeats grew clearer as the sun drained from the sky. I counted them in the stone, a drumline of impatience. 4, maybe 5 riders. Close enough that their curses carried on the wind when they struck the lower trail. Thorne's men, the remnants that hadn't run when the bear tore loose. My gut told me Thorne himself wasn't among them, not yet, but men like him didn't have to be present to poison the air. His shadow rode with them, urging them on. Nara's hand drifted to her ribs, pressing against the fresh wrap I'd tied that morning. The gesture wasn't weakness, it was calculation, the way a soldier taps the stock of his rifle before the first volley. She tilted her head toward the high shelf of rock above us. A silent suggestion. "Climb higher, vanish into the red bones of the mesa." I shook mine. Too much open sky up there. We'd be silhouettes against God's own canvas, easy as tin ducks in a carnival booth. Instead, I guided her deeper into the overhang until we could slide sideways through a narrow slit where the stone broke like an old scar. The gap widened into a hollow that smelled of dust and bats and time itself. Darkness took us quick, wrapping around our shoulders. The hoofbeats clattered past, riders angry, spitting words that sounded like they'd already decided how to carve us up once they found us. None thought to stop. None thought to check the scar. Cruel men often forget the land is cleverer than they are. We stayed pressed into the stone until the last echo faded. Only then did I let the tension leak out of my jaw. My teeth ached from clenching. Nara's breath trembled, but not from fear. It was the steady release of someone who has learned patience is sharper than any blade. She looked at me in the dark, her eyes catching what little light remained, and for the first time since we'd fled the cabin, I felt a current pass between us that wasn't survival alone. It was something like trust, fragile as spun glass, but real. When night owned the canyon, we moved. The desert changes its face after sundown heat leaves. Shadows grow teeth, stars spill like silver coin across black velvet. I let Nara lead. She knew where to place a foot without waking the gravel, where to cut through mesquite without stirring the quail. Twice we froze while the riders looped back, their lanterns swaying like drunken ghosts across the ridge. Each time, she pressed close against the rock and breathed so shallow I couldn't hear her. I matched her rhythm, letting her steadiness anchor my fraying nerves. By midnight, the riders gave up the circle and pushed east, chasing dust that wasn't ours. We angled west, climbing into harsher ground, where the soil turned iron hard and the cactus grew mean. My shoulders screamed with each pull upward, the wound still raw from the Dynamite's concussion. When I stumbled, Nara caught my arm with surprising strength for someone half-broken herself. She said nothing, just steadied me, then kept moving. Pride tastes bitter when you swallow it, but sometimes it's the only thing that'll wash thirst down. We made camp in a dry wash tucked under a stand of pinyon. No fire, no light, just the hard honesty of stone for our backs. I tore strips of jerky and gave her the larger piece, but she pressed half of it back into my hand. That quiet gesture, unspoken equality, struck deeper than any word could have. We ate in silence, coyotes yipping far off like gossiping children. The stars burned so bright it felt like they could see through us. I should have slept, but sleep was a stranger I couldn't trust. Instead, I found myself studying her profile against the starlight, the proud line of her cheek, the stubborn set of her mouth, even in rest. This wasn't a victim I'd carried from wreckage. This was a woman who'd endured 1,000 betrayals and still stood. Whatever story her scars told, it was longer and harder than mine. Toward dawn, when the sky bruised from black to purple, she stirred and spoke. Her voice was raw from disuse, yet strong. "You ask no questions," she said, each word chosen as carefully as a bead threaded onto sinew. I shook my head. "You'll tell what you want told." Her gaze lingered on me. Then she lifted her chin, as if offering her name was an oath. "Nara. Nara Skywalker." She paused, watching my reaction as if measuring what I'd do with the gift. "It means the light." The desert wind carried the name like it had been waiting for it. I repeated it, slowly, reverently, letting the syllables soak into my tongue. Nara Skywalker. The sound softened something jagged inside me. I hadn't realized how badly I needed a name to attach to this fight, how much stronger a vow feels when it belongs to someone real. She searched my eyes, and in hers I saw not fear, but the terrifying fragility of trust. "Now you know," she said. "I am more than what he calls me." "He'll never call you anything again," I muttered, meaning it as both promise and threat. We moved again before the sun climbed, choosing the crueler paths because cruelty hides you better than kindness does. By midday we found a spring seeping from the rock, guarded by reeds and dragonflies that glittered like living jewels. I knelt and filled the canteen while Nara cupped her hands and drank straight from the earth. Water ran down her wrists, carrying the dust with it, and for one quiet heartbeat the world was almost gentle. But peace is never permanent in the West. As we rose, a shot cracked from the ridge above, shattering stone inches from her shoulder. We dove back into shadow, my rifle already at my cheek, searching for the glint. I caught sight of a rider silhouetted against the sky, rifle barrel smoking. He was alone scouting, maybe or else too reckless to wait for the others. Either way, he was foolish enough to expose himself. My shot dropped him before his second could chamber. He fell like a sack of wheat down the slope, his hat cartwheeling after him. Dust puffed where he landed, then stillness. Nara's hand gripped my arm. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. That's not what survival sounds like. Instead, she pointed down the valley. "They'll come. We must move." She was right. The shot would carry. I grabbed the canteen, shouldered the rifle, and we pressed on. Our pace was punishing, the sun a merciless overseer. The land tore at us, thorn snagging fabric, rock bruising bone, heat peeling willpower like bark from a tree. Still, we kept going, hour after hour, until the sky bled orange and the earth turned soft with shadow. At last we found a canyon fissure narrow enough to swallow us whole. We collapsed inside, bodies shaking, lungs raw. For a long while neither of us spoke. We just listened to the silence, trying to decide if it was a gift or a trap. When no hoofbeats followed, I allowed myself to believe we'd bought a night's reprieve. That night, by the faint glow of a shielded ember, Nara leaned close. Her voice was low, but steady. "He will not stop, Thorn. He will follow until the world ends." "I know." My voice was gravel. "But so will I." Her eyes softened, the fire painting them in shades of amber and grief. "Why? You owe me nothing." I shook my head. "I owe myself. I've spent 10 years running from one broken promise. Saving you, it's the first thing that feels like balance." She looked at me for a long time, then finally closed her eyes, and though her breath trembled, she laid her head against my shoulder. That small weight undid me more than any wound. A man doesn't realize how starved he is for connection until it comes to rest beside him in the dark. We slept fitfully, waking at every rustle. Yet morning came without gunfire. We lived another day. The following 3 days blurred into a crucible of dust, thirst, and stubborn will. We traveled by night, hid by day, always one step ahead of shadows we couldn't see. My shoulder wound festered. Fever came in waves that left me stumbling. Each time I faltered, Nara pressed cactus pulp to my lips, sang low in her tongue, forced me forward with her will alone. When she weakened, I carried her, ignoring the fire in my muscles. We became each other's crutches, each other's stubborn reasons to keep standing. On the fourth dusk, we reached a ridge that overlooked a shallow valley. Beyond it, faint smoke curled from cookfires, civilization of a sort. A mining town I knew by reputation, Dust Fall, lawless, hungry, ruled by whoever had the most guns and the least conscience. A poor place for sanctuary, but the only one within reach. We crouched there, staring at it from the ridge, exhausted and hollow. For the first time since the Dynamite blast, I allowed myself to think maybe, just maybe, we'd carved a sliver of victory from this chaos. We'd outrun the riders. We'd survived the desert's teeth. Nara still breathed beside me, fierce as ever. False hope can taste sweet when you're starving. I looked at her, meaning to say as much, but her eyes were fixed on the valley, and the fire in them told me she knew what I hadn't admitted. Dustfall wasn't an end. It was another storm, maybe worse than the last. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The days that followed were a blur of aching movement, sun, and shadow. My shoulder, jarred from the close proximity of the Dynamite blast, and the long, rough ride, throbbed with a persistent, angry fire. Nara guided me, her knowledge of the unforgiving landscape proving invaluable. She was no longer simply a passenger. She was the pilot, reading the subtle shifts in the sand, the direction of the sparse, tough scrub, and the ancient signs of the rock to keep us hidden and moving. The world I thought I knew, the world of maps and white man's boundaries, was useless here. Nara's world was a living, breathing tapestry of survival, and I was the humbled student. One evening, as the sun was setting a violent canvas of orange and red, painted across the endless horizon, we found temporary shelter in a small, rocky outcropping. Nara, despite the lingering pain from her wounds, was a whirlwind of quiet, focused efficiency. She gathered brushwood, careful to keep the resulting smoke to a minimum, and found a patch of moss and herbs that she began to crush with a smooth, river-worn stone. Her movements were graceful, economical, and deeply purposeful. She wasn't just surviving, she was living the language of the land. She knelt beside me, her deep brown eyes fixed on my throbbing shoulder. "The swelling is bad," she said, her voice a soft command, her accent melodic and sharp. "It must be drawn out." I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength. Nara didn't possess a white man's sterile knife, so she used a shard of razor-sharp obsidian she'd found. Her hands were steady, her gaze unflinching, focused with the concentration of a healer who knew the cost of failure. As I watched her work, slicing the swollen skin with fierce care and pressing the bitter herbal paste into the wound, I saw not the fragile victim, but the strength of a healer, a woman who held the dark secrets of the land in her capable hands. She was indeed my Skywalker, an eternal fire blooming in the heart of the desert. When she was finished, she wrapped my shoulder with a strip of her torn buckskin, then, without a word, tore another strip and wrapped her own torso wound. Finally, she looked up at me. "My people," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence. "We have a place. A canyon we call the Hidden Tears, where the sun cannot find you. I can take you there." I hesitated. I had spent my last decade running from the people I had failed, burying my past in solitude. Going to the heart of the Comanche world would be the most profound act of faith and vulnerability I could imagine. It meant laying down my gun and exposing the very wound of my honor. But I looked at her quiet strength, at the trust I had so dangerously earned, and knew I had no other choice. She was my only compass, my only chance. The journey toward the hidden tears was a crucible of pain and determination. I was weak, my body screaming with every step, my fever coming in waves that drenched me in sweat. Nara forced me onward with a mixture of immense patience and sudden, burning fury. She sang low, monotonous songs of endurance, words I didn't understand but felt like a lifeline. Once, when I fell to my knees in the dust, ready to accept the quiet end of it, she stopped, pressing her forehead fiercely against mine. "If you stop here, you stop forever," she commanded, her eyes burning with defiance. The wall does not fall in the dust. The land itself seemed to conspire against us. Sharp shale tore at our boots. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, and buzzards circled overhead, patient and hungry. But Nara knew the desert as intimately as her own body. She led us to hidden, bubbling springs, to shade beneath ancient cottonwoods, to cactus fruit, whose juice she pressed to my cracked lips, keeping me alive one bitter, necessary mouthful at a time. Twice, she pressed a hand to her belly, a gesture quick and subtle, and once, she pulled back from the cactus fruit, a faint wave of nausea passing over her face. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the lingering fever, but the image stayed. On the third dusk of our arduous journey, the crisis hit its peak. I nearly bled out. The bandage slipped, the clot tearing as I stumbled hard against a jagged rock. My vision went white, then red, then dissolved into a black, roaring void. When I woke, the sky was a deep, impossible blue full of blazing stars, and Nara was crouched over me, her hands stained dark. She had used heated stones, pressing them against the wound, chanting words older than the canyon itself. The pain that ripped through me was sharper than any blade, but it was the pain that dragged me back from the edge of the abyss. "You will not die here," she said, a quiet, non-negotiable command. Every step after that was borrowed time, my body moving only by the sheer force of her will and the raw power of her healing. She had become the spirit of fierce survival that I had long admired and thought buried with the men I failed. By the time we reached the throat of the hidden canyon, I was more specter than man, carried by her relentless resolve. But when I saw the first hints of the canyon walls of deep, red sandstone rising like eternal cathedrals, painted by the morning sun, something fundamental stirred in the ruins of my soul. My survival was no longer just a debt to her, it was a promise. Nara had carried me across the threshold of death itself, and I owed her more than just my life. I owed her a future, a life where her people would never again suffer betrayal from men like me. We reached the entrance to the hidden tears at dawn. The canyon was a labyrinth of rock and shadow, a natural, towering fortress. Nara led me through a narrow, almost invisible passage, and then we were there. It was a hidden world of ancient stone and whispered prayers. I was a stranger in a strange land, and I could feel the intense, measuring eyes of the Comanche people on me. Their gazes were filled with suspicion, hostility, and a weary, deep-seated wariness. They saw a white man, a former ranger, a ghost of the past. They did not see the man who had fought a grizzly and faced down Thorn to save one of their own. An elder, a man named Rising Sun, whose face was as weathered as the canyon walls, stepped forward. His eyes were a cold, hard challenge. "Why have you brought this man here, Nara Skywalker?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound that resonated with authority. Nara stepped forward, her small body forming a fragile shield between me and the elder. "He saved my life, grandfather," she said, her voice strong and clear, resonating with the courage of her defiance. "He risked his own to save mine. He is a man of honor." Rising Sun looked at me, a long, devastatingly searching look. "Honor?" he scoffed, the word tasting like ash. "A white man's honor is a flimsy thing, a lie told to justify their greed and their theft of land. My training, my pride, urged me to fight back, to defend my past, to justify myself. But Nara's quiet strength, the memory of her hands tending my wounds, held me still. I knew I couldn't fight them. I had to earn their trust. I had to prove I was worthy not with a gun, but with my truth. I let go of Nara's hand and stepped forward, facing the elder. "I don't expect you to believe me, rising sun," I said, my voice low and steady despite the trembling in my knees. "I have made mistakes. I have seen good people die because of my failure. I have lived with that shame for a decade. I didn't save your granddaughter for glory or for money. I saved her because my honor, the piece of it that still exists, demanded it. If you want to kill me for the sins of my past, then do it. But know this, I am no longer the ranger I was. I am a man who fights for what is right, not for what is easy. I am the man who owes your people a debt." Rising Sun looked at me, searching my eyes for any flicker of deceit. He saw none. He saw a man who was broken, burdened by his past, yet genuinely seeking redemption. He saw Silas Vance. "You may stay," he said, his voice finally, infinitesimally softer, "but only under watch. Time will show if your words are truth, and you will not bring your kind of war to our home." Nara squeezed my hand, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. I had passed the first test. For the next few weeks, I lived among the Comanche. It was a time of intense healing, a slow, painful path toward a new kind of learning. Nara nursed me back to health, her hands a gentle comfort, her steady presence, a constant anchor in my life. She taught me about the local herbs, about the traditions of the Skywalkers, about the fierce history of a people who had endured more pain and betrayal than I could imagine. She was showing me a world I had long forgotten, a world defined by honor and resilient strength. I watched her with her people, and I finally understood her completely. She was a woman who had been to hell and back, yet her spirit remained unbroken. She had chosen to be a survivor rather than a victim. And in that quiet, hidden world, I finally found my true purpose, not as a ranger, not as a lonely rancher, but as a man who was finally, slowly, earning his place. The weeks transformed me. The wound in my shoulder mended, but more importantly, the gaping wounds on my soul began to close. The Comanche, once suspicious, began to accept me, not as one of their own, but as a man who had earned his right to exist among them. They called me the wall who stood, a name I wore with humility, a name that spoke of the immovable choice I had made in the face of death. I learned silence, and what it truly meant to listen to the wind, to the laughter of children who no longer flinched from my presence, to the prayers whispered softly at dawn. I saw that their faces carried deep history, but they refused to let that history become chains. They walked the earth with a quiet steadiness that humbled me. In the firelight, I was no longer a man on the run. I was a man rediscovering what it meant to live with purpose. For the first time in years, the weight of my rifle felt lighter, as if violence was no longer the only language I understood. Nara, my Skywalker, had not only saved my life, but had given me a reason to live it again, healing me with her quiet love in the most unlikely place, a war-torn desert. One day, as we sat by the fire, watching the stars bloom, Nara's uncle, Little Fox, a respected warrior and scout, approached us. His face was grim. "Thorn lives," he said simply. "He is patched up, meaner than a cornered rattler, and has gathered more men. He has moved into Dustfall, a lawless mining town." Then, Little Fox delivered the final, crushing blow. "Thorn knows who you are, the wall who stood, but he knows more about Nara. He is claiming she ran away with something valuable that belonged to him, something she helped him steal years ago, and the bounty is now doubled. And he's telling everyone that Nara is the one who betrayed her own people to the cavalry years ago, that she's a traitor who deserves to be burned." The lie, the ultimate betrayal designed to turn her own people against her, was a brilliant, cruel stroke of villainy. Thorn wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was trying to destroy Nara's honor, her past, and her only sanctuary. My hands clenched into fists. I had saved her life, but Thorn was trying to take her soul. I looked at Nara, whose face was pale, but whose eyes were blazing with a cold, righteous fury. "He wants to make me a ghost," she whispered. "He wants to make sure I have nowhere left to run." The path was now terrifyingly clear. We couldn't stay, and we couldn't run. The only way forward was through Dustfall. The ultimate crisis was here. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. Dawn came up thin and gray over the Badlands, a pale thread stitched along the seam where earth meets whatever heaven will afford a man who's done both wrong and right. I stood there with my hat low and my jaw set, listening to the wind comb the prickly pear and scrub. A man can read a lot in the way the morning breathes. This one breathed like an oath. "We do it in daylight," I said at last, "before he can turn the night into an alibi." "Oh." Nara's face held that desert stillness I'd come to trust, the kind that keeps a woman upright when bullets have already argued their case. "Daylight makes fear smaller," she said. "Not a question, not a boast. A truth." Little Fox arrived with dust on his shoulders and urgency in his eyes. He moved like a message the earth had been trying to deliver for days. "Thorn has runners," he told us. "He has tongues in every doorway. If you strike, strike so the whole town must watch. If seeing is believing, then make them see." "We will," I said, "not just with smoke and gunfire, with proof." I had spent the night walking the hard edges of memory, opening old rooms I'd kept shuttered since the Rangers. Names came back. So did procedures, seals, and the dull bureaucratic habits that trailed the cavalry like a second supply wagon. Thorn's story didn't start in Dust Fall. Every thief is first an accountant. Every butcher first a clerk. He'd left a paper trail somewhere because men like him don't trust partners. They trust ledgers. By mid-morning, we had a plan that wasn't pretty but had the virtue of being honest to our limits. Nara would work the alleys and shadows she moved through like a wisp of night, reaching the women who carried bruises where lace was supposed to sit, and the boys who swept floors and kept ears. Little Fox would fan out to the pickers and the mule skinners parked 2 miles east in a wash the town pretended not to see. I'd take the straight road, the livery, the smithy, the mercantile places where a man with a scar and a rifle might be listened to if he spoke plain and swore to stand where he said he would. "Make them ready," I said. "When the bell of Street Agnes hits noon, they come to the street. Thorn expects fear. We will give him witnesses." Nara's hand found mine warm, steady. She pressed a small bundle into my palm, wrapped in red cloth and twined with hair as black as raven feathers. "For straight paths," she said, "and for courage that isn't loud." I tied the bundle to my belt. Some men think belief is a powder to be measured in a horn. I've seen it work better in a thread. We split then, 3 silhouettes peeling off into a town that had learned not to look itself in the eye. Dustfall was louder today. The gilded cage had a piano going early, the notes slick with a gambler's grin. A card sharp laughed too long on the porch and clanked his spurs like a man trying to convince himself he was iron. I kept to the boards, letting every boot step count the seconds I didn't have. At the livery, a boy named Milo swallowed when he saw me. He had rope burns on both hands and a way of looking at the ground when a man in a hat leaned in his direction. "You'll pay me for my words?" he asked, too quick, shame already forming its nest in his throat. "I'll pay you with my spine," I said. "I'll keep you standing if men try to knock you down. Money comes after." That confused him enough to make him listen. "What's in the back stall?" I asked. He glanced that way, then back at me. "Crates," he whispered. "Thorn's men brought 'em last night. Said they was farm equipment. Stamped with stars like the army uses, but they weigh wrong, too heavy for plows, too quiet for seed." "Where's the key?" "On Thorn's belt, always." I nodded once. "You did good, Milo. You stand by the church at noon." I tapped the prayer bundle at my hip. "And you stand by me." At the smithy, Hoka's name another Hoka. Same sun-etched dignity that sits on the shoulders of men who live by heat and patience, bent his head when I told him what was coming. "Truth is an iron," he said. "You heat it right. It will take a shape no man can bend back." "Ring your hammer at noon," I told him. "Make the sound carry." At the mercantile, the clerk I'd seen tremble in Thorn's orbit squared his shoulders when I laid it out plain. The stolen army mark, the payroll crates, the old sin of a winter camp traded for coin. "I have a ledger," he confessed at last, as if spitting up a stone he'd swallowed years ago. From before, the judge had the sign repainted. It lists consulting fees, big ones, paid to a scout whose name isn't written, only a mark. The same mark sits on the corner of Thorn's personal papers. "Bring it when the bell rings," I said. Bring it in your own hands. Noon drew nearer. In the alleys, Nara stitched a net out of whispers. The women of Dust Fall Stella, with the steady eyes and a bruise like a wine stain down her jaw. Mary with 2 kids and a husband who'd lost his job when he didn't bow fast enough. Ellen, who poured whiskey for men who called her by a name she didn't recognize. Each of them carried something small that could tilt a balance if dropped at the right moment. A note with a date, a ring they'd been made to pawn, a memory of a boy taken in the night and found months later, working a sluice with fingers that used to hold marbles. You owe me nothing, Nara told them. You owe yourselves more than he has let you keep. This. The women looked at her like a fire that promised heat without taking the house. Little Fox did his work in the places white paint doesn't reach. He found a one-armed miner who'd been paid in scrip that vanished when the judge changed the company name. A cook who'd been told to double the stew with water when Thorne's men came through so they could feed 5 with 3 and pocket the difference. And a quiet Mexican teamster named Alvarez, who had a memory for brands and swear words and the way a box feels when coin lives in it. Bell at noon, Little Fox told them all. Bring your truth like you bring your lunch held tight and not to be shared with thieves. I spent my last minutes in the back of the church, looking up at a cross someone had hammered out of barrel staves, too crooked to be pretty and therefore perfect for the place. I am not a man of prayers, but I know the discipline of breath. I know how to ask my body to keep its promises when bullets make a case for breaking them. When the bell of Street Agnes found the hour, it didn't ring pretty. It clanged like a wake-up slap. Hoka let his hammer add its punctuation, and for the first time in a long time, Dustfall turned its head toward something that wasn't a bottle or a game. Nara stepped out of the alley then, bareheaded, eyes forward, ribs wrapped tight beneath a cotton blouse that had seen more desert than a map. She took her place at the edge of the street where the sun couldn't blind her and the shadows couldn't claim her. Little Fox came to her left. I walked to the middle and planted my boots like fence corners driven into bedrock. Thorne's men moved first 2 from the saloon with the casual swagger of dogs who believe their master owns the yard, and a third rake who had the nervous tics of a man whose soul had more stitches than skin. They laughed when they saw us. Then the church bell kept on ringing and the laugh ran out of their mouths like water out of a cracked bucket. Barton Thorne emerged, smooth as an advertisement. The scar the bear gave him cut a red smile along his cheek, and he wore it like a medal. He took the center of the boardwalk beneath the gilded cage's gilded lie and raised his hands as if the town were a congregation and he anoints them with counterfeit grace. What an honor, he said, voice wide enough to touch the alley mouths. The wall himself, and the girl, and a committee. His gaze slid over the gathering faces that were beginning to show, half curious and half afraid. He clucked his tongue. Seems Sunday came early and brought sinners to the front pew. You talk like a judge, I said. Let's see if you can stand like one. I lifted my Winchester and pointed not at his chest, but at the big gas lamp anchored over his saloon doors. A breath later, the glass shattered and the street exhaled smoke. The sudden dim drew men out of doorways like moths, realizing they'd been chasing a lantern and not a moon. It wasn't darkness yet, but it took the swagger out of the light and gave it back to the eyes. We do this now, I said, loud enough to make the bell shut up out of respect. Here, where lies break their teeth on witnesses. A murmur ran through the town. The clerk from the mercantile edged forward first, hugging a ledger to his chest as if it might decide to run. Stella left the saloon's porch steps and crossed with the shoulders of a woman who had made a choice and would not repent. Milo came, skinny knees knocking, until he reached my elbow and set his jaw like a boy who intends to graduate into a man by supper. Thorne's grin sharpened. Careful, friends, he purred. There's a reason good folk let me keep order. You pull the nail that holds the house, the roof will learn to fall. House never stood straight, Hoka called, voice like iron cooling. He stepped into the street with his leather apron still on and his hammer in his fist. You braced it with fear. We'd rather sleep under stars than in a house built of lies. Thorne's eyes nicked irritation. Something inside him had expected a quicker fold. He gestured at Rake. Go fetch the crates, he said. We'll show them we keep tools like any honest outfit. Rake hesitated half a heartbeat too long. The town saw it. Then he ran for the livery. Today, Barton, I said, We do it the way men used to do it before greed made them soft. We will name our claims and present our proofs. N6. You think this is a court? He laughed, the sound trying too hard to be easy. This is a street. Streets belong to whoever can walk them without bleeding. Then stand, Nara said, her voice ringing like the last clean bell after the storm. Stand in your truth, Thorn, if it can hold you. He looked at her then, really looked. Hatred is one thing, recognition is another. The muscles along his jaw flickered once. You? He breathed low. The winter girl. I was a child, she said. The winter you sold. The crowd went quiet in that way. That means something oldest in them can smell the shape of the story coming. Speak, I told her. Speak as witness. Nara didn't preach. She catalogued. She listed the names of ravines and washes like beads on a string. She gave coordinates as only a child who learned her world by walking it until her soles read its grammar could. She spoke of a scout, no face, only a drawl, and a habit of scratching a mark into the dirt when he was bored. She named the mark and then turned to the clerk with the ledger, who opened to a page where the same mark sat in the corner like a spider that had found fat flies among thin numbers. Thorn's smile didn't vanish, it curdled. Inventive, he said. But poetry doesn't pay a man's wages. Alvarez came then, quiet as the shadow of a wagon. He laid his palm flat on the back of the ledger and spoke from the sod of his throat. I hauled boxes with the U.S. stamp, he said. For 3 months, the stamp looked honest. Then it changed. Same star, different maker. A brand a man could copy in 5 minutes if he had ink and a reason. What reason? I said. Alvarez tipped his chin at Thorn without touching him. The kind that rattles when you shake it. Coin. Ugh. Stella added her thread. A ring she'd been made to pawn when Thorn levied a fine against her for refusing a customer with fists for manners. The pawn ticket bore the same mark. Mary held up a chit for flour that went nowhere once Thorn reorganized the company's store. Milo did the bravest thing a boy can do. He didn't speak. He led 20 frightened steps across the boards to the livery's back stall and held up a lock that hung open. The crate tops had been pried not by crowbar but by desperation. Rake reappeared, sweating, with 2 men and one of the lids tilted in his hand. He reached the middle of the street and stopped, because there's a pitch of silence that turns muscles to sand. He looked around for permission like a dog checks a master before it steals bread. Thorn stared him into obedience. The lid came off. Inside lay canvas sacks printed with a quartermaster's scrawl and the government's seal, the ink ghosted by time but stubborn as winter. When one split under its own weight, double eagles spilled out, yelping sunlight as they fell. The sound they made landing on wood is a sound a town doesn't forget because it sounds like the truth finally showing its teeth. Someone swore. Someone crossed himself. Someone laughed in that cracked, choked way a man laughs when he finally sees his enemy standing in a puddle and realizes the water rose from his own stolen well. Payroll, I said, not bothering to keep the contempt out of my voice. Men bled for it. Families waited for it, and a scout hid it under plows and lamp oil. You've been buying thrones with soldiers' wages and the grief of widows. Thorn's hand drifted toward his pistol, then drifted back because even he could count. There are numbers written in the human face when a group makes up its mind. The street had shifted, the weight of it moved to one side, and stayed. He recovered fast. Men like him trained for sudden arithmetic. The army loses track of funds all the time, he said. Shrug in place, smirk repaired. You going to try your little case in a town where the nearest marshal is 2 weeks and a washout away? If I have to, I said. But today, I try it here, before the court of the people you fed on. Oh. Nara stepped forward until the wind found the loose hair at her temples and played with it like a child. He told you I betrayed my people, she said. He said I led soldiers to my family's winter camp. That was his story, so you would hold me as a traitor and hold him as a judge. He drew the map, not me. Her voice started low and got smaller, not bigger, as she went because real grief doesn't need volume to burn. I remember the way the snow squeaked, the stillness right before the horses came. I remember the shape of a boot print with a notch in the heel. The man who made that print drew a mark when he was bored, a mark like this. She put her finger on the ledger, exactly over Thorn's private spider. The boy who'd been held hostage 2 nights prior stepped forward from the cluster of onlookers. He clung to his mother's skirt, but raised his chin like a bird that has learned it can stand on its own branch. "He did," the boy said, voice small, bright. "He hides behind children." The street drew breath at once and held it. "I don't care how tough a man pretends. There's a place in him that won't forgive a coward with a gun and a child in front of it." Thorn saw it go and panicked in the only direction he knows, forward. He lunged for the nearest sack, grabbed a handful of coins, and hurled them into the street like a magician flinging doves. Gold skittered and flashed. Reflex twitched. 2 men dropped to their knees on instinct. Thorn went for his pistol. I'd been waiting for the flinch all morning. My shot wasn't at his chest. It chewed the plank at his toes and spat splinters up his shin. He stumbled, and the pistol clattered. Before it stopped sliding, Hoka's hammer landed on it and flattened the trigger guard like a bad habit beaten into a better shape. The sound was not pretty. It was right. "Stand," I told Thorn quietly. "Stand in the daylight." He didn't. He reached for rake, for a shield, for anything that could put a human body between him and the reckoning he'd dodged a decade. Rake yanked free and went white. Bullies are surprised when their disciples find a spine. It offends their theology. Thorn turned then, not to run, but to shout. He wanted noise. He wanted confusion. He wanted the piano to come back in and make this another night where lies wear tuxedos. He pulled breath to yell with, but the church bell stole the air from his mouth, and the clerk read out loud the sums and dates on the ledger. Dollar figures can be poetry when spoken to the hungry. By the time the last number reached the last porch, Dustfall had learned a simple thing that should never feel extraordinary. A town can choose its name. I took 1 step closer and let him see exactly how much distance remained between who I had been and who I had become. "I am not here to hang you," I said. "I am here to stop your story from owning hers." I tipped my head toward Nara. Her eyes met Thorn's. She didn't blink. "I have seen warriors break a man with less." "Give him his end," the mercantile clerk whispered. Not to me, but to the crowd. "Give it to all of us." The sun slid a little higher, and the shadow of the lamp frame drew a neat box around Thorn's boots, as if the day itself had decided to build a small, sufficient jail. "Evening," Thorn said lamely, to no one, because his mouth had grown accustomed to words walking ahead of him and finding welcome. There was none now. Only the uncomfortable shuffle of a man who has worn fine leather too long and just discovered barefoot is the only honest way left. I lowered my rifle. It made a sound like a verdict that doesn't need a gavel. "Not yet," I said to the town. "Not the end. Not until every voice is heard. We finish what he started when he called himself a judge." The crowd pressed closer, not like wolves, but like citizens. Behind me, Nara's hand found the small of my back. It wasn't a push. It was a blessing. It said without words, "Now." I breathed once more, slow and long. The hard part of being a wall isn't standing. It's deciding which weight you'll bear. "Then we will hold court in the street," I said. "And the law we use is the one decent men recognize when they look their daughters in the eye." And the street Dustfall's long, crooked courtroom fell quiet enough to hear a coin stop rolling. We made a circle there in the dust. No benches, no rail, no swearing in with a Bible that had gone missing from Street Agnes years back. The oath came in other forms. A mother's grip on her boy's shoulder, the smith's blackened thumb pressing at the edge of his hammer, the seamstress's needle stuck through her cuff for safekeeping, as if to say, "I mend what men like you tear." Thorn attempted a smirk and came up with a twitch. "So this is your law," he said. "Mob rule with better manners." "No," I told him, "this is testimony. You can pay a judge, you can scare a deputy, but you cannot teach 100 throats to lie the same way at the same time." Little Fox stepped first into the circle. He spoke of runners and messages paid for with coin that smelled like brass polish and the inside of ledgers. He used names the government learned to ignore because they were Mexican or Comanche or poor, and he said them with the patience of a man setting stones in a river for children to cross. The river rose inside the listeners. The stones held. Alvarez stood with a wagoner's quiet. He took a coin from the busted sack and balanced it on his forefinger. "This is an eagle," he said, "but hear it ring." He flicked it with his nail. A good coin sings one note. This sings two, the kind that's been shaved and re-stamped. Honest money doesn't wear two faces. The clerk read again. Dates in winter when no ore came up from the shafts, yet the consulting fees grew fat. No consulting occurs when tunnels are snowed shut, he said. Only stealing. Stella added the bruise of memory. She didn't cry when she spoke about the night Thorne's man put a hand around her throat and said the house's share took more than the till could show. He called me property, she said. He told me law was what he said at the table. I want my name back. By the time Mary held up her flower chit, the town's temperature had changed. Men who 2 days ago would have folded under Thorne's grin now rested hands on one another's shoulders or crossed forearms over hearts, as if testing strap. Nara waited until the circle had weight, until the truth had built enough momentum to carry her grief without splintering it. Then she stepped forward and unrolled a strip of buckskin she had kept hidden beneath the wrap at her ribs. On it, in faded charcoal, sat a map drawn by a child who had walked every arroyo and counted every juniper that the winter snow remembered. "It is not pretty," she said. "It is what I saw. Here is the winter camp." Her finger tapped a hollow, and the sound it made on the stretched skin was intimate as a heartbeat. "Here is the tunnel where we ran. Here is the place where the horses made circles before they came in from the north. Obat." She lifted the buckskin and turned it so the town could see the mark at the edge, the little spider Thorne scratched when boredom needed a friend. Gasps came, not at the mark, marks are only marks, but at the way the child's hand and the clerk's ledger and Alvarez's ear for false coin all harmonized into one song you could no longer pretend not to hear. Thorne took a half step back. It would have been nothing if he hadn't done it 3 times over the last hour. A man can give ground inch by inch and tell himself he's just repositioning for better aim. The body knows when it's retreating. "Fine," he spat, trying to sound bored. "You've told a story. Stories aren't law. You've got coin? Take it. You think the army's going to thank you for showing them how sloppy they are? You think marshals get on their horses for a dusty town and a girl who learned to draw in the snow? You told the story first," I said. "You told it about her. We're just telling it back with the parts you left out." I looked at the boy with the notch in his courage that would one day fit a man's duty without rattling. "Son," I said, "you said he used you as a shield. Do you want to say it again now, in front of him?" He swallowed. Boys let the swallow mark their throats like a badge. He grabbed me by the collar. He lifted his chin. He put a gun to my head. He told everyone to stop or I'd die. His mother's hand shook, but she didn't pull him back. The town didn't cough. The silence gave his words more space than they needed, and therefore exactly what they deserved. Thorne's stare went for the boy and got met by something that wasn't anger yet, but would ripen into a kind of civic rage if fed. He blinked. "You can fight me," I told Thorne. "You've done it for months, one coward's flank after another. Or you can stand in the thing you built your court and let it pass its sentence. Either way, I will not shoot you in the back. I am not you." "Sentence?" he snarled. "What gives you the right to—" "Not me," I said. "Them." I stepped out of the center and handed the middle over to the people Thorne had been practicing on like they were an instrument. It surprised him men who hoard power always expect you to hoard back. He stared at the space where I should have remained and found instead the town's reflection. The sheriff, new badge, old fear, hovered at the edge of the circle, like a man trying to decide if drowning is better than the shame of learning to swim in front of witnesses. He came forward now, slow, and took off his hat. "I was elected to keep peace," he said. "I kept quiet instead. I don't know how to fix it, but I can start by doing one thing right." "Barton Thorne," he said, voice shaking then finding itself, "you are under arrest for theft, kidnapping, coercion, and bearing false witness to cover murder." Thorne laughed, mean and high, but he didn't move. The badge had spoken. A badge is only tin until a community remembers what it means. Then it weighs as much as the first law ever spoken under heaven. "You going to cuff me with your courage?" Thorne sneered, but he put his hands out anyway because even his arrogance could read a room and see that if he didn't, the town's rougher mercy would prevail. The cuffs closed like a door that had been waiting a long time to swing. The noise they made a small clink, barely audible over the bell, and the quiet breathing traveled down the street and into the open windows where women stood with curtains bunched in fists, into the blacksmith's forge where iron cooled and decided to be useful again, into the livery where Milo leaned on a post and dared to smile without apology. Rake didn't run. He slid to the ground and wrapped his arms around his knees. I don't forgive men like him easy, but I have seen softer men become harder and break. Sometimes watching one bend is a kind of justice that keeps you from wasting bullets. Search his office, the clerk said. You'll find more marks. We did. Stella led the way, because courage deserves first look. We found a safe with numbers greasy from overuse, a wall map with pushpins where caravans had gone missing, and a drawer of stamped letters, dispatches to a quartermaster, with the salutation whittled off and replaced with "friend." In the bottom drawer, under a sheaf of bills written in a hand that loved itself too much, lay a single cavalry shoulder strap, stars cut off, blood long since turned to the brown that keeps you from remembering exactly what color a man was when he died. Nara held the strap between finger and thumb like a relic. He wore a uniform once, she said softly. He took it off when the cost grew too honest. Rake had followed us in. He looked at the strap and didn't look away. He told us the law was a costume, he muttered. Like a woman's dress or a priest's collar. You put it on when you wanted something. That is the kind of lie that rots men from the inside, Nara answered. The law is a promise. You keep it even when it costs you. We carried the papers back into the sun, where the town had the right to read what had been done in its name. People leaned in, passed the letters hand to hand, a communal liturgy of the unblinded. No one cheered. Relief came the way rain sometimes does on the plains first, as the scent of wet dust. Then as a settling cool that takes an hour to believe in. Marshal? Someone asked at last. Practical cutting through the miracle like a plow through good loam. There's one in Haviland, the sheriff said, tipping his hat toward the east. 3 days if the river behaves. I'll ride with 2 men I trust. We'll lock Thorne in the freighting shed until dawn. The freighting shed had barred windows and a stubborn door. We put Thorne inside without spectacle. He tried a few last flourishes, promises of money, then promises of mercy, then the old weapon, contempt. None found purchase. He was learning the hardest lesson a tyrant can learn, that communities are slow, but once they stand, they are heavy. The next morning, the sheriff hitched a team and rolled a cage wagon to the shed. 2 men, I could vouch for Hoka's nephew, and Alvarez climbed up with rifles across their laps. The boy who had spoken stood with his mother at the corner, chin high, showing Thorne exactly what kind of father this town intended to be for its children going forward. Thorne tried one last angle as we loaded him. Vance, he hissed, you think you won? You think killing me with paperwork and sob stories makes you clean? I don't kill men with stories, I said. I kill lies with them. He spat near my boot and missed. The door latched. The team leaned into the trace. The wheels made that hollow wooden sound wagons make when a job is honest and heavy. We watched the cage roll down the street and head east toward Haviland. People didn't wave. They didn't throw things. They did something a town forgets how to do when it's been held hostage by a personality. They went back to work. In the quiet after, the clerk carried the ledger to me and held it out like a baby, awkward and reverent. What do we do with it? He asked. It's proof, but it's also a weight. Keep it, I said, but don't hide it. Put it where anyone can read it. Let boys learn to read from it if you must. Better they learn from the math of theft and repentance than from words that pretend the world doesn't ask prices. Lo. He nodded, relief loosening his shoulders as if the book had been pressing his lungs the whole time. We stood with the town for the rest of the day, helped Hoka reset his sign, helped Mary carry flour not paid for twice, hammered back the gilded cage's swinging doors without their guilt. Nara moved among women with a gentleness that makes strength ache, speaking little and listening much. The boy trailed me like a second shadow until his mother laughed and told him to let the ranger breathe. I told him I had air enough for 2. In the late afternoon, the wind shifted and brought with it the smell of wet rock from far-off hills. The first real breeze Dustfall had owned under its own name in years lifted the dirt and made the sky look taller. Little Fox joined us by the trough. "We did not make the world right," he said, "but we made this street less crooked. That's all a man can do," I answered. "One street at a time." "We could have stayed." The clerk asked it in his soft way. The sheriff asked it in his blunt way. The women asked it with looks that said, "A town sleeps easier with burdens divided." A piece of me, a piece that had gone long without a roof that didn't leak guilt, wanted to say yes. Nara's fingers traced the bones of my wrist. "Walls don't marry houses," she said, a smile like dusk easing across stone. "They hold the hill so the houses can stand." "You could start a school," Mary suggested to Nara. "Teach the girls to stitch, and the boys to read maps that don't lie." "I could," Nara said, and there was a light in her that made the suggestion a seed instead of a tease. "But the road is calling. Somewhere, a map is still wrong." Dusk slipped down the facades and made the windows warm. Men lifted their hats